get it done. I understand this caller's frustration. We are all frustrated beyond belief, but we can't let frustration guide our actions. We have to do this in a very smart, wise, sensible way.
Okay, the minority leader
for a
and
posse, not a lynch mob.
all right, the minority leader and the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Richard Gephardt. Dick Armey, thanks for joining us on this day.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's go to CNN's Darren Kagan now in Atlanta for a check of the latest developments in America's new war. Darren?
Well, thank you very much. We want to go ahead and start with new information that has been revealed about the U.S. military's response to the 4 hijacked airliners last Tuesday. According to Vice President Dick Cheney, orders were given by President Bush to shoot down incoming commercial airliners over Washington immediately after the terrorist attacks took place in New York and at the Pentagon. However, no fighters were able to intercept those airliners before they crashed. Also, the Pakistani government on Monday will ask the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden in 3 days or face massive military action led by American forces. U.S. officials do not expect the Taliban to cooperate on that one. In New York, Afghan ambassador to the UN, Ravon Farhadi, who represents the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, that is the anti-Taliban movement in Afghanistan, he said that today the Northern Alliance will make 15,000 troops available for any attack against Taliban-held Afghanistan. And we have a correction to tell you about from earlier. CNN showed what law enforcement sources who are working with the FBI had told us were pictures of some of the alleged hijackers. We are now told, however, that by the FBI that the picture we showed for alleged hijacker Abdulaziz Al-Omari was incorrect. The man we actually showed was Abdul Rahman Al-Omari, whom the FBI says is not under investigation for the hijackings. CNN, of course, sincerely apologizes for that mistake. We want to move on and give you more information about the story that is developing today over word we're getting from Vice President Cheney that President Bush on Tuesday had given orders that it was okay to shoot down a commercial airliner if indeed it did pose a threat. And let's bring in our Miles O'Brien has more information on that. Miles.
Well, Darren, ever since that fateful morning, there's been a lot of speculation about the 4th and final aircraft that was hijacked, United Airlines Flight 93, which left Newark Airport bound for San Francisco. And this is a replay of FAA radar telemetry of that flight. It flew out pretty much on course, took a U-turn at Cleveland, so it went fairly far before the apparent hijacking occurred. And then, as we, of course, know, crashed into some rural country, a remote part of Pennsylvania. Now, the question was, it being the last flight of the 4, was there time for the U.S. military to intercept that flight with a fighter and be faced with the prospect of shooting it down for fear it was headed to, say, the U.S. Capitol or some other target in Washington? It was headed on a trajectory to the Washington area. Vice President Cheney on Meet the Press, the NBC program, had this to say just a little while ago.
The President made the decision on my recommendation as well, wholeheartedly concurred in the decision he made, that if the plane would not divert, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
All right, now a couple of things to consider here. First of all, there were fighter jets in the air by the time this situation was occurring, so it is possible that the timing would be such that a fighter jet might have had that opportunity had that plane continued on. It is routine in the case of a hijacking for the FAA to notify NORAD to scramble fighters to try to intercept the plane, try to get the plane, force them down onto the ground. We were talking with General Wesley Clark just a little while ago about what the options would have been for that fighter. Obviously, an absolute last resort would be to squeeze the trigger. They would have tried perhaps to signal the plane down, try to force the plane down, and then ultimately, as a plane got nearer to the nation's capital, given what we've just heard, had the authorization to do what would have been a terrible, awful thing, and that would have been to squeeze the trigger and bring down a civilian airliner loaded with 35 passengers. Now, as we know, what happened, based on some conversations received by loved ones on the ground from passengers, what happened was the male passengers about this time here made the decision to attack the hijackers on the plane. They were told by their loved ones that the attacks had already occurred on the World Trade Center, in essence knew their fate, and apparently made the decision to attack the hijackers. We can only presume that there was a struggle which led to the crash there in Pennsylvania, thus taking the decision out of the hands of the U.S. military and perhaps an F-16 pilot. So that's just one more tidbit as to what was happening in the skies on that very fateful morning. Darren?
Well, and Miles brings up the question, as people around the country get on airliners again, is that something they have to face, the possibility that they too could be shot out of the sky if it turns out that they are on a jet that holds some kind of threat to something on the ground?
Just, add it to your list of worries here. I mean, that's one of the many things that we all have to contend with as we face the prospect of getting back on aircraft. And we do know this, and the Vice President was very pointed in saying this as well, that particularly over the nation's capital right now, there are fighter jets in the air at all times, so-called AWACS aircraft, airborne radar aircraft. So this statement was as much a little bit of history as it was, I think, a warning to would-be terrorists in the future, that not only is there the authorization potentially there, but the aircraft are already in the air.
All right, Miles O'Brien, thank you very much. Also want to talk about the call-up. We have been talking about the call-up of military reservists in recent days, thousands of them, about 35,000. But the question also comes into play, what about troops that are already in service, and what are the plans for them? Let's go to the Pentagon right now, and our Jamie McIntyre, who's standing by. Jamie, hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon. The message from the Pentagon is that the call-up of reservists right now is limited to protecting the United States, putting fighter planes in the air and watching what's going on in the skies, and assisting civil authorities in disaster relief in both New York and Washington. If the U.S. were to mount a major military operation, it would need to call up additional reserves. But listen very carefully what Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says today, as he is trying to prepare Americans for a very different kind of war.
It is not a war that a military campaign deals with. It is a broad-based, sustained, we're talking about years, not weeks or days, and there are not armies, navies, and air forces to go after. They have no battleships. They have no aircraft carriers. These are people who operate in the shadows, and we have to deal with them in the shadows.
Same message from Secretary of State Colin Powell, of course, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, telling CNN's Wolf Blitzer just a short time ago that this is not necessarily going to be a major military campaign. He described it as primarily an intelligence war, a law enforcement war. Yes, there may be military action. It may even involve troops on the ground. Special operations forces are going to try to arrest or capture suspected terrorists. But what the United States is trying to, what the Pentagon is trying to prepare the U.S. public for is a long campaign against terrorists that will have a military aspect to it, but will be something that will go on for a long time, with the ultimate goal of making Americans feel more comfortable and less threatened by terrorists. And that is going to take years. And don't expect any necessarily quick military action. Darren?
And sounds unlike anything Americans have seen before this. Jamie, if you will, I want to go back to the report we were talking about with Miles O'Brien. Vice President Dick Cheney coming out today and saying that indeed on Tuesday, President Bush had given the okay, if needed, to shoot the commercial airline, United Airlines Flight 93, that was on its way from Newark to San Francisco, if need be, to shoot that commercial airline out of the sky. Anything you can add from the Pentagon angle?
Well, first of all, that would be obviously an option of absolute last resort. And what the U.S. is working on now is new procedures that would prevent the U.S. Air Force from ever getting into that situation of having to make that dreadful decision. One of the other real questions that's raised by the scrambling of jets and the alert that was given to the FAA is that whether or not there should have been some warning system to evacuate government buildings in Washington. Now, no one could have known that this jetliner was heading for the Pentagon, but it was known sometime before the event happened that the U.S. was under a terrorist attack. Certainly that was clear by the time the second jet hit the World Trade Center tower. It would take some very quick figuring, and this is all in hindsight, but if you were able to figure out that you were under a terrorist attack and you were able to evacuate government buildings in Washington, perhaps other buildings as well, there might have been some lowering of the death toll, but it's very hard to figure out. Same thing if you shoot down a plane. If you shoot down the plane that was heading for the Pentagon in this major Washington area, there are dozens of places it could have landed and caused even more casualties. So it's a very vexing problem.
A lot of tough choices. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Jamie, thank you very much. We want to focus now on Afghanistan. The Taliban opposition there has also offered assistance in bringing in suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden. Northern Alliance officials tell us that Osama bin Laden has gone into hiding since Tuesday's attack. Whatever the U.S. response is, the Afghan opposition tells CNN it does want to play a part.
We are fighting the enemy of the world, which I mean Osama bin Laden. If the United States of America is about to show a reaction against terrorists and their collaborators, they should consult us and see how much effective our support in our cooperation would be.
Meanwhile, another part of the story from Afghanistan, word of a possible military strike against Afghanistan is sending thousands fleeing to the borders. Many residents have evacuated the capital city of Kabul. Our Nick Robertson is there. He has more on the reaction to the threatened U.S. action.
Bustling trade in Afghanistan's street markets belies an impending sense of isolation beginning to grip many Afghans. Concerns about the likelihood of an American attack and the possibility borders with Pakistan and Iran may close have driven food prices up 10 to 15%. Concern also Afghan people could become innocent victims. They should wait until it's clear Osama was involved, this vendor says. America shouldn't make any attack on Afghanistan, this trader says, because the Afghan people are not involved and not responsible. Many here, however, are too poor to flee the cities. 22 years of conflict has ruined infrastructure and economy alike. The years of war have also built up a resilience among many Afghans, to the point where a new attack would be a continuation of their ongoing battles. The result of Russian aggression was the breaking of Russia into 16 countries, this old man says, remembering the 1980s Soviet occupation. If America attacks us, Allah will divide America into 52 pieces. From influential tribal elders, not necessarily aligned with the Taliban, however, a call for diplomacy.
We advise the Taliban that they must discuss everything with everyone and not close the doors to negotiation.
However, the tribal elders also said if Afghanistan is attacked, they will back the Taliban to the end, a sentiment echoed on the streets here. As the last of the international aid workers began leaving because the Taliban said they could no longer guarantee their safety, Afghanistan's total isolation appears now closer than ever. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
And before we throw it back to Wolf, we want to show you some pictures that we just got in within the last hour here at CNN. CNN having a chance today, and our Aaron Brown going along for the ride with the Coast Guard. You're going to see the first aerial view of the destruction at the World Trade Center. And while we look at these pictures quickly, the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, confirming 180 deaths in New York so far. 115 of those have been identified. The mayor, though, revising the number of missing at the World Trade Center upward to 5,097. He says the rescue operation will go on until all hope is lost. And as well as we toss it back to you, the mayor and the governor saying today that it is still very much considered a rescue operation.
Darren and I'll be speaking to Mayor Giuliani shortly. Later in this program, I'll also be speaking with the Pakistani ambassador to the United States. But joining us now are 5 members of the United States Senate. Here in Washington, Michigan Senator Carl Levin, he's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Virginia Senator John Warner, he's the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Indiana Senator Richard Lugar, he's a member of the Intelligence Committee. And from Boston, Massachusetts, Senator John Kerry, he's also a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And in our Miami Bureau, Senator Bob Graham, he's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Senators, thanks to all of you for joining us. First of all, to you, Senator Lugar, what should the United States do right now?
2 things. The diplomacy that's been described is essential, not only Pakistan, but try to identify those interests that Russia, China, other nations have with us with regard to terrorism. That is going to have to be a long-term project, but the short-term aspects of it are obvious. The NATO declaration, obviously the work in Pakistan, but the trying to find how we get a network of support that is important if we're going to root it out. And secondly, in the Homeland Defense, not only the FBI investigations, but reorganization of our own government so that the National Guard units, our armed forces, the first providers, are in a network that clearly is not very well centralized or organized, despite a lot of discussion about that. These are essential to guard not only our airlines, but communications and financial situations. I would just add to this, obviously, the work against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and materials has to be intensified. If, in fact, terrorists finally do get their hands on any of it, then the effects would be absolutely devastating, not just single buildings at a time.
Let me ask Senator Graham. He's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. How serious of a threat is that, Senator Graham, that the next time around it might not just be airliners filled with gasoline and passengers, but it could be nuclear or biological or chemical agents?
There's a saying that the generals always fight the last war, and we need to be careful not to be overly obsessed with the hijacking of airplanes as the means of carrying out terrorist offenses. I agree with Senator Lugar that the next may be a chemical or biological weapon inside a suitcase. In answer to your question about what our immediate priorities are, I think first is continuing the efforts to see if there are any survivors in the rubble of New York or the Pentagon. Second, the CIA briefed me earlier today the fact that we are not certain that Tuesday was the only act of terrorism in this plan, that there are still possibilities both outside and inside the United States of further terrorist activities, and so we need to be on a very aggressive level to root out all the information that we can about that and try to interdict any future acts of terrorism. And third, we need to continue the investigation to determine precisely who committed this horrendous assault against America and be able to rally the world community in a united front against these specific terrorists and terrorism in general.
So what you're saying, Senator Graham, based on this intelligence briefing that you had, is that Americans here in the United States and Americans traveling around the world who may be watching this program right now should remain on guard?
Absolutely, and not just Americans. That the part of the plan may have been to be executed outside the United States, aimed at U.S. citizens, but also at citizens of other countries.
Senator Levin, you're the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We've heard from our Pentagon correspondent. We've heard from the Secretary of State. This is not the normal kind of military operation that the United States is used to. What can you tell us about the next specific military steps that might be necessary?
Those are being looked at. The options are all being considered, but if I knew which options were going to be used, I would not share them with you here. I don't think we yet know what will be the most effective options. What we do know are a couple things. One is that it must succeed. So it's got to be carefully planned and executed. We can't just strike back in a way which is ineffective. Secondly, it's very clear to me that if we have a broad alliance with us, we will be much more effective. If we have some Muslim nations with us, it'll be far more effective, because if we don't have Muslim nations with us when we strike back, and we will, then bin Laden and his types will be able to say, aha, it's us against them. If Muslim nations join with us, it will not play into bin Laden's hands as it otherwise might. That is our long-range goal, is to go after terrorists, not play in their hands, and that means it's the world versus terrorism, not the West versus Islam.
Senator Kerry, you're, of course, well known as a Vietnam veteran. When the United States got involved in the early 60s in Vietnam, it looked a lot different, of course, than when the U.S. left in the 70s. Are you at all concerned that what the U.S. is getting itself involved in right now could turn out to be another Vietnam?
No. I mean, it just isn't. There isn't even any comparison. I mean, the country is united, galvanized, I think is the word, because we have been attacked in the most clear and dastardly way. I mean, every American understands the nature of this threat, and not every American clearly understood the nature of our presence in Vietnam. And I think that the key here, and I think the President understands it, and I think each of the comments you've heard from my colleagues, and particularly the comments you heard from Secretary Rumsfeld today, I thought they were good comments and very important ones, and from Secretary Powell. No one is articulating this as a quick event. No one is suggesting that this is going to be war as we've known it in the past. This is different, and Americans need to recognize that. We all need to recognize that. There's a lot of thinking to do. There's a huge amount of adjusting to do. There's a great deal that we need to do on the diplomatic front, and part of this war will be exactly that, a different kind of diplomacy. Much of it will be a very different kind of intelligence effort, both the intelligence gathering and the level to which we undertake it, as well as those things that the intelligence community may engage in. We're going to have to change those rules. In addition to that, we clearly will have some kinds of military events. I am convinced, all of us, we will need to. But we've got to remember who the target is here. We don't want to create, I think it was Carl Levin who just mentioned this. I mean, we cannot allow this to become Islam versus the rest of the world, or the rest of the world versus Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion. The Taliban itself is led by people who are not particularly steeped in religion or schooled in religion. They're not religious leaders as we've known them within the Islamic world. And I think that we have to recognize that Islam itself needs to be part of defining its own peaceful existence and desires, and recognize the threat to all of the world through this kind of terrorist activity.
Let me bring in Senator Warner, who used to be the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Now you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member. Your home state, your state of Virginia, took a direct hit at the Pentagon. Did you ever in your life think that something like this could happen at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center?
No, Wolf. I spent 5 years there during Vietnam as Undersecretary, Secretary of the Navy. And while fiction wrote these things up, none of us ever thought it could happen. But the one thing here, it did happen, and it may have happened at a point in time when we can now go to war, as the President said, against terrorists and prevent them from getting weapons which, it's hard to believe, cause greater destruction to the United States, whether they're chemical, biological, or the missile attacks, which concern me. But let me just point out.
Well, let me just interrupt for 1 second, Senator Warner.
Well, we ought to start every one of these discussions with expressing our prayers and our hearts for the victims, particularly on this day, Sunday. Every night I go to bed, every morning I get up. They're foremost in my mind. Now, your question.
And I agree completely with you, but the question is this. Why did it take this kind of a disaster to mobilize the U.S. government, the American people, if you will, to get engaged in this war on terrorism?
When Carl and I have been in our committee now 23 years, when I was chairman, I set up a special subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee called Emerging Threats. And for the 2.5 years I was chairman, we were working very hard to try and to look into the future, to put our dollars and assets where they're best needed to combat just the type of thing that we saw happen. Other parts of the Congress were working, but not with the commitment that we have today. We're unified behind our great president. And I want to say to the American people, part of that support has to be the exercise of patience and understanding. We cannot answer every question. Some of us may have answers to it, but it's not in our security interest to say it. The people understandably want direct action, be it military or otherwise. It is wise, and when I was with the President just 2 days ago, he was calm, confident, well-informed, and he will act at such time as he and his advisors are absolutely certain that's the time to act. So we've got to exercise patience and support, and part of that is understanding that all of us here in Washington are working together as a team, unified in the Congress.
Let me bring your chairman back for a second and ask you the same question. Why did it have to take this kind of devastation? We've been hearing about terrorist threats for God knows how long. Why did it take this to mobilize the government?
Because here the attack was brought to not just to Americans, but to Americans in a huge way on our homeland. This is different. in the scope of the attack. But by the way, I think many of us have been fighting very hard to move dollars into the fight against terrorism and away from some of the lesser threats. And that's really what should have been done, looking back. And I pray and believe will be done now is that the most likely threats are the terrorist threats. We've been saying that number of years, including some of the folks in both houses of Congress. And I think that now that has been proven clearly the correct path, and that's where we're heading.
All right, Senator Lugar, you want to weigh in on this?
I would just say that until this point, a large number of the American public were not as interested in foreign policy and defense policy. As a matter of fact, the debate we were about to have on the defense appropriation bill was in question as to whether there would be support for even the fairly modest desires the president had. Now that debate changed because the public changed its mind, and we are fortified by that public resolve.
Senator Graham, you must feel, I was going to say, Senator Graham, you must feel totally frustrated as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee that it took this to get the kind of action that apparently is going to happen right now.
Well, let's put this incident, however, in some context. There have been many previous terrorist initiatives in the United States which have been understood and collapsed before they could be a threat. We had one just a few months ago when a person tried to come across the Canadian border in the state of Washington, clearly with a terrorist intent. This event of Tuesday, this terrible tragedy, is clearly a failure, and it cannot be described otherwise. It needs to be a failure which is an alarm signal that we need to heighten our efforts. The Senate Intelligence Committee will be introducing legislation this week to try to create a better command structure for terrorism response in the United States. We also have already recommended substantial increases in dollars for spies, for better technology, for eavesdropping, for better ability to analyze the tremendous volume of information we collect. We think those will be seen to be weaknesses in our intelligence system that contributed to Tuesday's tragedy. We don't want any of those weaknesses to continue a day longer.
What weakness, Senator Kerry, what weakness do you believe that this failure last Tuesday in the intelligence community, failure to get any advance warning that meant anything, failure in the security community, that these planes were hijacked simultaneously, almost, including 2 planes in Boston, the capital of your state. Tell us what immediate fix can be put forward to reassure the American public.
Well, first of all, I'm supportive, and I will be advocating it this week. We actually have a hearing on it. The takeover of our airline security by the federal government for a lot of different reasons. I spent some time in law enforcement. I know the value of getting state police talking to the local police, talking to the federal authorities, exchanging warrant information, movements between states. We never used to do that. Now we do it fairly well. But here, when you come into the country with your passport is checked, people can tell where you've traveled, where you've been, whether you're on a watch list, and so forth. We have none of that capacity in our airlines today. Unless you fly El Al and you're going to Israel, you don't go through a very lengthy interview, and it's been rather porous, and most Americans know it. And it was porous because, frankly, the business community and a lot of other people wanted it that way. They just wanted to be able to move quickly and easily. Now we know we can't. So I think if you had a coordinated effort whereby there was a sharing of information and a greater scrutiny with respect to who's boarding an aircraft, that's one piece of it. The second piece is you can guarantee that never again will an aircraft be used as a weapon. And the way you do it is by making it clear to every terrorist who's a prospective terrorist that they may get into an airplane, but they will never succeed in being able to pass into the pilot's cockpit because those doors are sealed for all purposes. So while they may kill a flight attendant or they may kill the whole airplane and themselves, they will not be able to fly it into a target. These are things that we can guarantee. But let me come back to a point. Again, I think it was made earlier. Bob Graham said it. Let's not get hung up on the notion that what happened on Tuesday is going to be the preferred avenue of attack in whatever may happen down the road. I assure you it will not be. Probably And no American will be safer flying in these next few days ever in history than they will be now. And the terrorists know that. So the next target will be something different, whether it's cyberspace, whether it's our water supplies or food or some other, a bridge, a tunnel. And this is why it is so imperative that we not recognize the solution to this is to give up our freedom. The solution to this is to secure our freedom by destroying the willpower and capacity of these terrorists to do this. And that is a longer, far more painstaking, but much more important mission for all of us now. And we need to focus on the cells and on the efforts in other countries.
Let's take a caller from Houston who has a question. Please go ahead, Houston, with your question.
Yeah, gentlemen, the news reports have said that the terrorists have had people in place in U.S. military-run schools. What I was curious about, what is the possibility of these terrorists being in place in our military as far as troops or even higher-ranking officers? And is the FBI investigating this?
Well, let's ask the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, first of all. What can you tell us about these reports that 3 or 4, perhaps 5 of these 19 terrorists who died in these hijackings, some of them at least, may have received training at U.S. military facilities?
We've asked for a report on that, and we'll get it. But I think it's important in the meantime that we not start becoming so suspicious of ourselves that we're going to lose our freedoms and, as a matter of fact, lose the ability just to have a life which is a relatively normal life. I don't believe that there's infiltration in the higher levels of our military. I don't think we should become paranoid. Obviously, we got to become more cautious, but we cannot let the terrorists destroy the fabric of our relationships, or else they would have succeeded.
Senator Warner, is it time to take a look at some of those programs where the United States brings individuals from other countries around the world and trains them to fly planes?
It's time to look at everything. Those programs have produced very valuable relationships over the years between ourselves and other countries in times of crisis. Those military people, having received training here, feel a certain loyalty and have stepped up. Let me go back and pick up on one thing. We are, this president, not, like his father, building a coalition. But those of us who watched carefully the engagement in Kosovo, where we had to sit with 19 nations in NATO around a table, and all had to be agreed before we did anything, we cannot follow that again. We cannot share, I think, as fully as we have, need all the intelligence, because these people move swiftly and quietly, and when we have them pinpointed, we've got to go. And on that point, there's discussion, well, should we use ground troops? Let me pick up. We have got to say that every asset of the United States is available to engage. The moment we take off the table some potential we have, whether it's through ground forces or other things, then the terrorists are going to skillfully plan to use that vacuum as their next avenue of attack. So everything should be on the table, all plans reviewed, and if we stand united behind our president, exercise patience, we're going to survive as a stronger nation.
Can I add one thing to that, Wolf, because I agree with it, but there's another aspect. We will be far more effective if other nations join with us. We can't take any of our own assets off the table. We've got to be ready for anything, and if necessary, to act alone, obviously. But we will be far more effective if it is a coalition, and will be doubly effective if some Islamic nations are part of that coalition, so it is not viewed in the Islamic world as the West versus Islam. It's got to be the West, including Islam, versus terrorists.
Senator Lugar, you're well known as one of the authorities in the Senate on international affairs. The opposite of what Senator Levin is saying is that if the U.S. tries to bring in all of these other coalition partners, it will restrict U.S. maneuverability, the U.S. ability to do what it believes is the best, take the best course of action. Are you at all concerned about that?
Well, there are a lot of restrictions if we're not able to get cooperation. I would agree with John Warner. We are not a group of 19, but we need to find out where we have common interest, where somebody is willing to work with us. We need to determine what we need to do. But I would just say one of the aspects of this, ironically, is we probably need to have more military people from other countries training with us. The problem here with the pilots was a lot of them were trained by civilian folks here in the United States, not our military. We are going to have to try to tie together with the military, with the diplomatic corps, but even more so with the intelligence people, unsavory as they may be, internationally with Russia, China, whoever is going to help us, because each one of these countries has a problem with militant Muslims on their border. They understand that, and it's the gut thing that's likely to bring them into our camp in this issue.
Senator Graham, you're the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. As you know, there's a lot of intelligence types in Washington have been grumbling for years, especially since 1995, that they've had sort of one hand tied behind their back. They haven't been able to go out and recruit sources, agents within these terrorist cells, put them on the U.S. government's payroll, if you will, out of fear that they would be criticized by Congress. How do you deal with that issue of having to get down there in the gutter, if you will, with rats if necessary?
Let me first comment on Senator Lugar's statement. I completely agree with what he and Carl Levin have said. I was in Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and prior to that time had a briefing from some Russian officials about their view of Afghanistan. And the Russians are as concerned about the Taliban as we are. They fought a 10-year war against the Taliban. Afghanistan is the principal source of heroin that's coming in to Russia. It is a destabilizing entity relative to those rather already unstable states on the southern border of Russia. So we have the potential of building an alliance based on self-interest of these other countries. As it relates to our restrictions, we've had a policy, particularly in the CIA, that we would not hire a foreign national who had an unsavory background. The fact is, if you want to get somebody to get close to bin Laden and be able to understand what he's thinking about and what actions he may be likely to take, I would not suggest that you go to the monastery to try to find that person. The people that have the ability to get close are likely to be people pretty much like the ones who are now working with bin Laden. So we've got to be more pragmatic in terms of our willingness to accept the fact that if it's important to us to be able to understand terrorist activities early enough to stop them from occurring, then we are likely to have as one of our tactics the ability to deal with some unsavory people who can serve a legitimate purpose of intelligence for the benefit of the United States people.
Senator Kerry, are you ready to go along with that and put some of these unsavory types, terrorists who have a lot of blood on their hands, on the U.S. government's payroll as sources, as agents inside, for example, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's organization?
Well, obviously, if they're well managed and within the limits of what you're trying to achieve, it's important to sometimes do that. I mean, when I was a prosecutor, we had an old saying. I mean, all prosecutors have the saying, when you're trying the devil, you don't go to heaven for your witnesses. And so it's fairly obvious that if you're going to try to get information, you're going to have to deal with these folks. And we've gotten a little bit goody two-shoes about it in the wake of a lot of other kinds of problems that we faced in the past. This is a different kind of fight now. We're not talking about states or countries or people who once upon a time adhered to some kind of international standard, who had a rule of law. These are complete renegades. These are terrorists. Their mission is to spread terror. They are attacking the very foundations of civilized society. And everybody has something at stake in that. So I'm absolutely prepared to use the tools necessary. When you're waging a war, you do what's necessary to win. And obviously, because we are the United States of America, we have always interpreted that to mean within our value system and without losing the best of what makes us different from other countries as the United States. But I'm prepared to do things differently.
Senator Warner, the Vice President Dick Cheney confirmed today that when one of those planes, those hijacked planes, was going towards Washington, U.S. fighter jets were authorized to shoot that plane down if necessary. I want to listen once again to what the Vice President said earlier today and get your reaction. Listen to this. Now, we don't have that soundbite, but let me read it to you, what Vice President Cheney said. Well, our viewers, I want to remind our viewers, if the plane would not divert, the hijacked plane, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
I accept that statement at face value, and it's one that we'll be examining this week, and what other steps we can put as a precaution, hopefully not to do that. You know, in this wonderful discussion we've had among 6 good friends and colleagues, I think what comes to the forefront that the Congress is unified behind the President. I ask Congress, as has others. Dick Gephardt was here with a brilliant statement a minute ago. We've got to get together, pass on these issues with a minimum of dissent, some debate, which is constructive, to explain to the American people what we do. I hope my colleague, Chairman Levin, and I, as we've worked together these 23 years, can get our bill up and give the President those things that he has asked for and which today and tomorrow and in the future he needs to defend this nation.
Senator Levin, I asked Secretary Powell earlier today if it was time to rethink the current ban that's been in effect since 1976, the prohibition on assassination. And he said it's time to rethink everything, in effect. I'm paraphrasing what he said. Is it time to perhaps lift that ban?
I think it's time to rethink everything, and some of the things we have to do secretly and quietly, regardless of what the express and the outward ban is. But I think we have to look at all options, including that, and whether it's done openly or whether it's done quietly, depending on the evidence and the circumstances. I think we have to we have to be willing to do that under the circumstances. As far as shooting down the plane is concerned, I'm glad to hear that they were able to move that quickly, to be able to take that action if necessary. Where I was a little surprised was that even though we had perhaps a half hour's notice that that plane aiming at the Pentagon had turned around, that there was no warning inside of the Pentagon or public buildings or other buildings in Washington. That is something that we'll look to over time. For the moment, though, and I just visited the Pentagon again this morning, by the way, the people who are working at the Pentagon are heroes and heroines right now, doing extraordinary work with huge American background and a totally united American people in Congress. It is a very impressive people, a very impressive thing, and people should be aware of it all over the country, that this is a united country and that we have thousands of people donating, volunteering services and money right now in a common effort.
Senator Lugar, I just want your reaction on that issue of rethinking the whole matter of assassinations.
Everything will be rethought, but I would just say the last retaliatory strike against bin Laden was a self-defense measure. And my guess is that we will define what occurs as defense, as self-defense, as justifiable. I think that was a reasonable interpretation at that time. I think that's reasonable now.
Senator Kerry, I just want your thoughts on this. I know that you've been studying this for some years. Rethink the policy of assassinations?
Certainly with regard to terrorism, no question about it. And I think that there is no question that we are going to have to do a great deal on the clandestine front here, our intelligence gathering, how we execute afterwards with respect to the information that we have found. I'm not sure any of us want to share all the options publicly at this point in time, but it's clear that, all of us have to put this in an historical perspective. This is different from anything that has happened previously to us. And the threat it poses to us is larger even than what happened to the World Trade Center. These people believe we are the infidels. They think we are the great Satan. They are conducting a deeply religious, deeply ideological war against us and have been for a long period of time. Our embassies have been blown up. Our ships have been blown up. Our airplanes have already been blown out of the sky or directed out of the sky. And we are now witnessing the last escalation. The United States and the civilized world cannot sit by and watch this happen. So we have to respond in whatever way we defend ourselves appropriately.
Unfortunately, Senator Kerry, we could go on. I want to thank you. I want to thank Senator Graham and our Miami Bureau, Senator Warner, of course, Senator Lugar, Senator Levin. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Could I have 5 seconds to tell you something, to show you how America can come back? Yesterday, the USS Cole was launched. She's back in the fleet. There's a clear example of the resolve in this country to fight back.
On that note, I want to thank all of the senators for joining us today. Thank you very much. And world leaders are declaring that a strike against the United States is a strike against all of the civilized world. CNN's chief international correspondent Christiane Amanpour spoke to the British Prime Minister Tony Blair earlier today. She joins us now live from London. Christiane, give us the headlines.
Well, the headlines, I think, Wolf, are that Tony Blair, first of all, having been one of the first and loudest condemning the bomb attack on the United States and standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, today said for the first time that he, like President Bush, views what happened as an act of war and a declaration of war. He then went on to say that that they were still waiting for the evidence and that, the future action was being considered, but that he believed there would be a very strong international coalition and that Britain would most likely, I read this between the lines, take part in any military action.
I'm very pleased at the way that America and the American administration has gone out of its way to consult its allies, to keep us fully informed so that we are part of the deliberations they're making. But we have to do two things, in my view. First of all, there has to be a response to bring those terrorists who committed this attack to account, and we will play our full part in that. And secondly, there has then to be an agenda that we construct at an international level that involves the whole of the international community in dismantling the machinery of international terrorism, how it's financed, how these people move about the world, the countries that then harbour them and give them help.
Now, what the Prime Minister was talking about was a long and sustained and difficult intelligence-gathering campaign, detective work, and all the kinds of non-military kind of work that will have to go in to the way the world leaders are describing their campaign to cut off the head of these terrorist cells. There has been unprecedented international support for the United States, and coming from not only the usual allies around the world, but also from some of the least suspected areas. For instance, in Iran, for the first time, hardliners and reformers condemned this attack. Iran, of course, has been accused of sponsoring terrorism in the past. They had a moment of silence at a football game. The mayor of Tehran sent a message to the mayor of New York today. I mean, these are unprecedented things. In Yemen, in all the other countries around that region, an enormous amount of political support for the United States at this moment. Wolf?
Christiane Amanpour in London, once again, thank you very much. I want to go now to the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, Malia Lodi. She joins us now in our Washington bureau. Madam Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Tell us the latest from your government. Is the government of Pakistan issuing an ultimatum to the Taliban and, in effect, to Osama bin Laden to hand over Osama bin Laden within 3 days?
Well, as you know, there are UN sanctions on Afghanistan, and that prohibit travel to that country. What we have done today is to approach the UN Sanctions Committee for permission to allow a delegation from Pakistan to travel to Kandahar to urge upon the Taliban leadership the gravity of the situation, as well as to accede to the demand of the international community. And that demand, as you know, is now expressed in resolutions of the UN Security Council as well as the UN General Assembly, which call for all countries of the world to join in the war against terrorism and to bring to justice the perpetrators of those who carried out these terrible attacks, these terrible terrorist attacks in New York and in Washington.
All right, let's walk through the process right now. When will this delegation from Pakistan go to Afghanistan and meet with the Taliban?
We are expecting this delegation to fly out tomorrow once we have received permission from the UN Sanctions Committee, which will allow that plane to travel to Afghanistan.
And then what happens then? Will the demand be that Osama bin Laden be handed over to the government of Pakistan?
I think the important issue right now is that we will be urging upon the Taliban leadership something that we have been talking to their representative in Islamabad as well, which is to accede to the demand of the international community. And you know what that demand is.
Spell it out for our viewers. They're watching all over the world right now.
The demand is to bring to justice the perpetrators of the crime that has been committed, which we regard in Pakistan as a crime against humanity, to hand over the person that they are harboring, Osama bin Laden, so that he is brought to justice.
And so just to be specific, the government of Pakistan does believe that Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda organization were responsible for these terrorist outrages.
Well, as you know, senior officials of the U.S. administration regard Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect. We are responding to the call of the international community as well as the United States in helping to see what we can do and try to use the diplomatic option before more extreme ways are evolved to deal with the situation.
Now, as you well know, Madam Ambassador, a lot of U.S. officials are skeptical that the Taliban will cooperate, will indeed find Osama bin Laden and hand him over to the international community. What happens if the Taliban simply says no?
Well, I think it's very clear that right now several options are being considered. We don't know how the response will evolve and how it will unfold. But I think what is clear, and as a member state, Pakistan is a member state of the United Nations, and under international law, we stand ready to implement all the decisions of the Security Council, and those decisions you're well aware of. They call upon all countries to help in the war against terrorism. We stand with the international community. We are consulting very closely right now with other Islamic countries, particularly our close friend and ally, Saudi Arabia, to ensure that we are all united and that the world is united in this war against terrorism. Let me tell you, my country has been afflicted by this menace for the last 2 decades. Pakistan has confronted terrorism in various forms. So we know exactly how it feels when you have to deal with something like this. There is no way that we can deal with this monster unless the world is united on this. And we stand ready to help and to extend our fullest cooperation to the international community to bring this menace to an end.
Let's talk about that help that the U.S. government will be seeking from your government. We heard Secretary Powell say on this program earlier that within the next few days, a high-level U.S. delegation will be sent to Islamabad, to Pakistan, to discuss cooperation between the two governments. Has the government of Pakistan made a fundamental decision to cooperate, if necessary, militarily with the U.S.?
I am not at liberty. I cannot discuss specific proposals that the U.S. administration has made to us, but I do want to reassure listeners, viewers, as well as others in the administration that our indication of firm support and fullest cooperation to the international community as well as the United States is firm and solid. Specific proposals are under discussion. You will appreciate the sensitivity of these matters. And I'm not at liberty to discuss specific proposals that have been made to us, but we will do whatever it takes to ensure that we stand with the international community to do what is necessary.
You know, of course, the many reports that one of the issues, one of the requests from the United States is to permit Pakistani airspace to be used, if necessary, for missiles or for U.S. planes, other planes, to fly over because Afghanistan is landlocked, as you know. Has the government of Pakistan accepted that proposal?
We have, again, you know, I can only answer this in the way that we have indicated a firm policy of support and cooperation. I cannot go into specific proposals that have been made to us by the United States because, as you know, the situation is evolving and I cannot discuss these in public.
I can understand that. One of the issues that was raised in one of the statements our Tom Mintier is reporting from Islamabad, he said that the Pakistani government, in expressing its willingness to cooperate with the United States, is imposing a condition that the government of Israel and the government of India not be included in any sort of coalition that would work against Osama bin Laden. Is that, in fact, the position of your government?
I'm not aware of anybody asking us in the first place about who will be part of this coalition. So, quite honestly, it's a hard question for me to answer because it's extremely hypothetical. What we have emphasized is the need for Islamic countries to be together on this, and Islamic countries are together on this. I think it's important for this international coalition to have a strong and visible component from the Islamic countries for obvious reasons. That is the point that we have made.
Well,
now, if somebody is characterizing that differently...
Just to be precise, no one was suggesting that anyone had asked Pakistan for suggestions on who should be included. This was supposedly a Pakistani initiative. Just don't include Israel or India in this coalition. It'll make it a lot easier for Pakistan to cooperate.
I think we're going into specifics here. I'm not aware of anything of the sort that you're mentioning, but I think our sensitivities on these issues should be kept in view.
One of the statements that was issued yesterday by the Taliban leadership is this, and I want to play it, a Taliban spokesman making this statement earlier this weekend. Listen to this.
If neighboring or regional countries, particularly Islamic countries, gave a positive response to American demand for military bases, it would spark up extraordinary danger. Similarly, if any neighboring country gave territorial way or airspace to USA against our land, it would draw us into an imposed war.
That sounds like a direct threat to your government from the Taliban not to cooperate with the U.S.
My government has taken a decision to cooperate with the international community, and we will do so.
Is there a quid pro quo? Is there anything you're asking the United States to provide Pakistan in exchange for your cooperation with the U.S.?
We are going to be cooperating as part of our international commitment to deal with the menace of terrorism. This is not the time to nickel and dime on these issues, and we're not engaged with that. However, we do expect our friends to help us manage the risks which are obvious in a situation as we go down this road. There is an immediate response that we know will have to be made, and then there is a sustained longer-term response that will have to be evolved. In this, obviously, we expect our friends to help us manage the situation. As you know very well, extremism grows in situations of economic decline. Extremism is born of despair and desperation. And my country has been through a difficult economic period, and we certainly expect our friends to help us through our difficult economic difficulties.
And as you know, I was in Pakistan last year, and I spent several days there meeting with high-ranking officials, but also with many other people. And the despair that is felt, the anger towards the United States for supposedly abandoning Pakistan after the Afghanistan war, has been translated to some significant support for Osama bin Laden.
Well, I think there are people who hold different points of view in Pakistan, and we have seen extremist points of view also being voiced in Pakistan, and you heard it for yourself. But we take comfort from the fact that the vast majority of Pakistanis are practicing Muslims, but they are moderate Muslims. That is also borne out by the fact that in every successive election that has taken place in Pakistan, the religious or the extremist parties have never done terribly well. In fact, combined, the religious parties have never been able to get more than 2 or 3% of the popular vote. That is a statement about the quintessence of the Pakistani nation, which is moderate and which is tolerant. That is the Pakistan that is extending its fullest cooperation to the international community on this issue.
U.S. intelligence sources have told me over the past few years they have a deep concern that some of the groups associated with Osama bin Laden may be gaining a foothold even within the Pakistani military. Is that a serious concern that the U.S. and others should have?
Well, I have not heard any U.S. official say that to my side or to me. I think we need to keep our focus on the cooperation. As you know, there are close consultations going on between our two countries. The presidents of our two countries have spoken yesterday on the telephone. We need to keep our focus where it really belongs, which is how to fight this menace to ensure also that there is security in the region where my country is situated. We are situated in a very volatile and dangerous part of the world. Obviously, we seek longer-term security and peace in our region. As I said, there is an immediate response, but we also have to look longer-term to see that we have an approach that deals with some of the underlying reasons which give rise to people who hold extremist views.
As you know, your president, Pervez Musharraf, was scheduled to come to New York to the United Nations for the opening of the General Assembly. Is he still planning on coming here?
No, he has. We have, in fact, conveyed to the administration the fact that he has cancelled his visit. He obviously does not wish at this point to be a burden at a time when your country is going through such an extraordinary crisis. I also wanted to take this opportunity, Wolf, if you will allow me,
Please,
to offer our sincerest condolences from the people and the government of Pakistan to the American people. We share your grief and we share the grief of the victims of this terrible tragedy. I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you very much, Malia Lodi, the ambassador of Pakistan to the United States. I assume you're going to be on this program frequently in the next few weeks and months. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.
And now let's go back to the CNN Center in Atlanta. Darren Kagan is standing by with a check of the latest developments in America's new war. Just one note, Darren, when we come back after the news, we're going to continue these conversations. We're going to have a panel, the U.S. intelligence community also have a panel on some religious leaders and what they're thinking and saying on this day. Darren?
Yes, and Wolf, they have been fascinating discussions to listen to. Also, we know our viewers are interested in the developments, and there have been a number of developments today following last week's terrorist attack, so let's get right to them. First, to Vice President Dick Cheney, who says that President Bush did give orders to shoot down incoming commercial airlines over Washington. That was immediately after terrorist attacks in New York and at the Pentagon on Tuesday, if those planes were judged to be a threat. At the time,